Well, you know, it can happen even to the most careful among us. Now, that picture cracks me up because those sheep are chilling back there kind of watching the whole thing going on, right? And I was wondering, well, I wonder what the sheep are thinking. So this is what I thought, maybe. Today, we're going to look at a story about someone who steps in it. By way of review, the one true God, Yahweh, selected and called a man named Abraham to leave the culture and the religion that he had grown up in to follow the Lord wherever he would lead. And amazingly, he left everything that he was familiar with to follow God on this journey, the destination of which he knew nothing about. God led Abraham from the city of Ur to the land of Canaan. And after arriving, Abraham built altars to the Lord to worship him and give him thanks for these incredible promises that God had made to him. The tent that Abraham lived in and the altars of worship that he built were symbols of his life. The tent symbolized his looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He lived his life as a pilgrim on earth. This was not his home. He was looking forward to the city of God. The altars symbolize this deep spiritual center of Abraham as a worshiper of the one true God, Yahweh, that he trusted in his promises and he had faith in his God. Well, last time it seemed like Abraham was doing everything right. But in the story we'll be looking at today, we will see that Abraham is a human being, just like you and me. He was not always a great lion of faith. There were times when he was filled with fear. There were times when he didn't trust God with his life. There were times when he placed his own interests before those of others and God. There were times when he really made a mess of his life and the lives of others around him. There were times when he really stepped in it. And I'm grateful that the Bible includes the human frailties and failures of its heroes rather than only recording their successes. We can start feeling a little intimidated and discouraged when we read the incredible faith stories of some of these individuals and then comparing ourselves to them. Because our faith is not always what it ought to be. If you're like me, you feel like you fail more than you succeed in your walk with the Lord. And it gives us hope when we see these giants of the faith, like Abraham, act like us and see that God continues to love them and use them. It reminds us of a very important truth, that God does not just love us when we are well-behaved girls and boys. He loves his children at all times. The Lord wants us to pursue holiness, to live rightly, to make wise choices, to live a good example for others to follow. But we don't do those things to earn our salvation or to preserve our salvation or to cause the Lord to love us or to keep him from leaving us. See, our relationship with the Lord is not a tenuous thing like human relationships can be. When a person comes into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, they're born again, as Jesus said. And a new life springs up inside that has a whole new and different nature. And with that new nature comes a new set of appetites and desires, a new kind of thinking, a new way of seeing reality. The old you is dead and dying, and the new you is alive and growing. The Holy Spirit takes residence in that person and begins changing them, nurturing and growing that new life, motivating and empowering that person to live differently. As the Lord promised in Ezekiel 36:27, he said he would put his spirit within us and cause us to walk in his statutes and be careful to obey his rules. Our motivation for seeking to live a holy life isn't fear, but love and gratitude. We have been so loved by the Lord that we want to express love back to Him. He's done so much for us that we want to express our gratitude to Him. We want to please our Heavenly Father because He's so good. We know He's always got our best in mind. He always knows what's best for us. We can trust Him with all things because all things are under His wise and loving sovereignty. We'll flip over to Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to continue our story in verse 10 today. In verse 10 it says, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." It says, now there was a famine in the land. Abraham's faith in God and His promises is being put to the test here in a new way. There's a famine in the land of Canaan, this land that God had promised to give to him. One might think that the land that the Lord had promised him would be beautiful and free of trouble of any kind. But there's a famine, and it's so severe that Abraham is forced to move out of the land in order to sustain his life. The land promised to him by God, it can't support him. It's actually hostile toward him. Think about what Abraham is facing here. I mean, he has left a very comfortable life back in Ur, if you'll remember last time as we talked about that. He now finds himself in the middle of a famine in this new land that he has moved himself and his family to. The thought may be going through his mind, what have I done? What have I gotten myself and my family into? Have I made a mistake? Did I hear the Lord's voice correctly? Maybe we should go back to Ur. He may have been struggling with questions about what God was doing. God leads him to this land, and now the land can't support him. It appears to be trying to kill him, trying to drive him out. He may have been struggling with questions about the quality of this promise that God has made to him. I mean, if the land can't support him now, why should it support him in the future? And why would anyone want to live in this land if that's the way it is anyway? There are times in our lives when we face difficulties and that seem to contradict the very nature of God and the promises that He's made to us as His children. Life can be hostile toward us sometimes. Does it mean that the Lord has abandoned us? Does it mean that He has changed His mind about loving and caring for us? Are the Lord's promises not really very good after all? Why does the Lord allow such terrible things to come into our lives? If He loves us, why does He allow us to suffer and experience pain and disappointment? The answers to those questions can't be completely answered for us in this life. Abraham, he didn't know why there was a famine in the land that God has promised to give to him. We don't always know why there is difficulty and pain in our life either. But the good promises of the Lord, they remain true. God has not gone back on His word to us. He has purposes that are higher than our understanding and higher than our circumstances. See, learning to trust the Lord through the dark and the confusing times, that's actually part of the experience. We need to learn to trust the Lord at all times, through all circumstances. Our trust in the Lord, it needs to rise above the circumstances. Our trust in the Lord, it can't be dependent on our circumstances. If it is, then our trust in the Lord is not really trust anyway, is it? Anyone can feel good about the Lord when our life is going well. It takes real trust to cling to the Lord through circumstances that are difficult and confusing. Well, to Abraham's credit, he doesn't return to Ur, but he does leave Canaan. It says, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So how does Abraham respond to the difficulty that he faces in the land of Canaan? He decides to move to Egypt. Was Abraham running from his problem? Was it right that he went down to Egypt? Should he have stayed put in Canaan in spite of the famine? Trusted the Lord to take care of him? We're not given any indication in the text about whether the Lord directed him to go to Egypt or not. May have been the will of the Lord for him to go there. We don't know that. However, in the next verses, we learn that Abraham comes up with his own idea about how to solve his problem. And without the Lord's intervention, it could have cost him his life. Verse 11. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, or Sarah his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me. But they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. Well, more questions arise about Abraham's faith in these verses. He's concerned for his personal safety in Egypt, thinking the Egyptians will want his wife and kill him to get her. So in an effort to protect himself from such a fate, he tells his wife Sarah to tell the Egyptians that she is his sister rather than his wife. And that way they'll treat him good as her brother. Well, now technically Sarah was his sister, his half-sister. We talked about that last week a bit. They both had the same father but different mothers. So what he tells the Egyptians, it's a half-truth, but it's really not the truth. Abraham's a human being, just like you and me. He's afraid for his personal safety and willing to do whatever he feels necessary to survive. And in the midst of worrying for his survival, he forgets about God's watchful eye over his life. You might remember one of the promises that God gave to Abraham is, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. In other words, the Lord said, I will protect you, Abraham. It's easy to forget the Lord's promises when the pressure's on, though, isn't it? We let the situation and the threat distract us from the promise. Can you imagine how much more peaceful we would be if we kept our focus on the good promises of the Lord rather than worrying about all the things that might happen? It'd be amazing, wouldn't it? Now, as a side note here, it's intriguing to think that this woman Sarah, who is at least 65 years old at this point, is still a woman of such stunning beauty that Abraham fears for his life. I'm sure there are some people who would love to learn her secret. I believe the answer to her beauty is found right here in the Bible. You look over at 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, it says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. The imperishable or unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit are to be sought after for both men and women. The words I share with you are meant for all of us, not just women. We should seek after these rather than being consumed with external beauty, which is a fading, temporary thing. People are often so focused on their external appearance that their internal appearance is completely ignored. It doesn't matter what a person's character is like, what their behavior is like. Hey, as long as they're looking good, The Lord wants us to be concerned with our character, our internal beauty, our eternal appearance, rather than our temporary external appearance. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to care for our outward appearance. I mean, make whatever improvements you want to your looks. Nothing's wrong with that. But that shouldn't be our primary focus. Our main focus ought to be our character, our eternal appearance. That's the imperishable, unfading beauty that will be with us, regardless of what we look like on the outside. Our heart, our character, who we are inside, invest in that. It pays dividends all our life, no matter how old or young we are, no matter what we look like. That's the part of us that is going to follow us into the next life. And this is really what made Sarah beautiful, I believe, more than her external appearance. And this is the point that Peter was making when he wrote those words to us in his letter. Verse 14, it says, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Well, Abraham's plan appears to be working out pretty well. At least at first. I mean, the Egyptians, they did indeed admire Sarah's beauty, as Abraham feared they would. And the Egyptians, they did indeed treat Abraham well as Sarah's brother, giving him many gifts of livestock and other things. But things have also taken an unexpected turn, haven't they? The Egyptians, they admired Sarah's beauty so much that they talked her up to Pharaoh, and he decided, well, I'm going to take her to be one of my wives then. Whoops. That wasn't supposed to happen. Now what's Abraham going to do? Did Abraham protest the taking of his wife? Doesn't appear that he says a word about it. He's probably terrified. As she is taken away, he's like, ixnay on the wife thing. I don't know about you, but I think we're forced to ask what kind of a man he is at this point. I mean, how could any self-respecting husband sit by as his wife is just taken from him like this? This is certainly a very different sounding Abraham from the one that we read about last time in the first half of Genesis chapter 12. There, he's this man of so much faith that he packs himself and his family and all of his possessions, and he follows God wherever he leads. Now, he's a man driven by fear and self-preservation. How can someone change so radically? From a giant of faith to a faithless wimp? Pretty easily, actually. Ask me. I've done it lots of times. I've done it in the space of 5 minutes before. Maybe you have too. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Well, thankfully for Abraham's sake and Sarah's sake, the Lord, he steps in on their behalf. Abraham certainly wasn't going to do anything about it, but the Lord is. The Lord is keeping his promise to protect Abraham. Pharaoh's household is now under a curse, and there is this serious disease of some kind inflicting them. So verse 18, so Pharaoh called Abram and asked, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go." And the Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Well, Pharaoh proves himself to be a more noble person in this situation than Abraham. When he discovers what's happened, he promptly returns Abraham's wife to him. He then orders his men to escort Abraham and his people out of their country. He's encountered the power behind this man Abraham, the Lord God, and he wants no part of it. The Lord graciously rescued Abraham from a potentially disastrous situation. Abraham and Sarah, they're supposed to have a child through whose lineage the Messiah of the world is to come. Well, left up to Abraham, that would have never happened, because Abraham would not have his wife Sarah anymore. But the Lord's looking out for Abraham and the world's future. This is God's nature, the way that he deals with his people. He's the great rescuer, the great saver, the great deliverer, the superhero who swoops down to free his people from the clutches of evil and their own stupidity. Verse 1 of chapter 13, it says, "So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold." Materially, Abraham had prospered while in Egypt. He had acquired considerable amount of wealth as gifts from the Egyptians. But spiritually, he's bankrupt. He'd forgotten the promises of the Lord. He had acted faithlessly. He'd acted foolishly. It must have been a very long, silent trip from Egypt back to Canaan. No one was saying anything. And you know, Abraham, he didn't make contact with anyone, especially Sarah. I'm sure it was one of those moments that could have been turned into a Southwest Airlines commercial. Want to get away? It was one of those times you wish you could rewind life's tape and relive it a different way. Abraham, he is in need of spiritual renewal. He's damaged and he's hurting. On the inside, Abraham looks like the land that he's traveling through, the Negev, a desert. Verse 3. "And he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai." It says, "And he journeyed on from the Negev," or the NIV says, "From the Negev he went from place to place." See that word translated, journeyed on, it means to wander, to go from place to place, to travel around by stages. It suggests that Abraham, he's not sure where to go. His destination wasn't clear. He's wandering. He's going from place to place. He's beat up. His wandering from place to place, it reveals a person seeking for his place in life. We're often seeking for our place too. Where do I belong? Why am I here? What am I to do with my life? Who am I? Who am I? We wonder why it's so hard to find that peaceful place of permanent settlement in this life. But you know, we're not supposed to find a place of lasting settlement here on this earth. We are created for a greater purpose. This is not our place. This place is not adequate for the vastness that God has created us for. It's too small for you. It's too small for you. You're capable of fellowship with God himself. Don't dumb down your desires. So this place is the thing you're trying to fulfill yourself with. It's not adequate. The old Puritan Jeremiah Burroughs wrote in his book, The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment, and oh, it is a rare jewel, is it not? Contentment. He wrote this. He goes, "My brethren, the reason why you have not got contentment in the things of the world is not because you've not got enough of them. That's not the reason. But the reason is because they are not things proportionable to that immortal soul of yours that is capable of God himself." That's just as if a man were hungry and to satisfy his craving stomach, he should gape and hold open his mouth to take in the wind. And then should think that the reason why he's not satisfied is because he's not got enough of the wind. No, the reason is because the thing is not suitable to a craving stomach. Abraham traveled from place to place, wandering, until, in verse 4, he came to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. See, Abraham's place is at the altar of his God, calling on the one who had led him to this land of Canaan. This is where he returns to. Abraham returned to the altar that he had built near Bethel and Ai, and there he called on the name of the Lord. Before the altar of his God, he's renewed and he's repaired. His vision is restored. His faith is strengthened again. His reason for life is reestablished and refocused again. That's what we need to do too, isn't it? See, one of the lessons about faith that Abraham and we learn in this story is that in the midst of our faith being tested, regardless of how we fare going through it, whether we succeed or fail, because it's really not about us succeeding or failing, it's about the relationship, or as some people say, it's about the journey. It really is. Our God remains faithful. He's faithful no matter what. And he's the one we can count on. Because our best laid plans can turn into a stinking mess in our hands. But the Lord is faithful and he can be relied on at all times. When we've made a mess of it, when we've stepped in it, we need to return to the altar of our God, that place of worship like Abraham did, and be cleansed and renewed. It's at this altar of the Lord, that place of worship, that we get our strength for life and our vision of eternity is renewed, where we look for the city of God again. That's where we're reminded of who we are and whose we are. We're to be people of tents and altars in this life. People who live our lives as pilgrims here, who are looking forward to the city of God. We're living in tents. We want to be people of altars, to people with a deep spiritual center, seeking after the Lord, worshiping him, trusting in his promises. Now, this is a great story, isn't it? Because it's right out of our own life. And Abraham, he's not so faithful, but God is. You and I, we're not so faithful, but God is. God's faithful. He's good. He's always good. Let's bow our heads. Father, I thank you for this story because it reminds us of your faithfulness. It shows us that you're faithful always. And it's a great encouragement for us, Lord, to know that our place in this world and our place with you is not dependent on us. It's dependent on you. We don't live on a razor's edge in this life. We live in the big, strong, powerful hands of our God. I pray that you would encourage your people today with that thought, Lord, that you're faithful, you're good. We can depend on you. We can always look to you. We can always trust in you. Help us do that more and more each day, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.